My name is Alec Seekins. I'm the high school pastor, and I'm really happy to have some of my friends over here this week. We just got back Friday morning at 12:30 in the morning. We got back from summer camp, and we spent a whole week just hanging out with each other, hanging out on the beach, going to Six Flags, going to water park, and really just kind of trying to grow together as a family. That was the thing that we were really pressing into, is this idea that church is meant to be a redemptive family. And today we're going to talk a little bit about that capacity of redemption that we find in Jesus. And particularly, we've been doing this series, as you guys know, on the other hours. And today we're going to finish up our sub-series on sexuality within that. And we're going to talk not about the other hours this morning, but more about for the rest of us, sexual purity for the rest of us. I think in church, I've noticed something, that we have a tendency to focus on one particular facet of sexual purity that is good and that is true and that is right and that is holy, but really only applies to a very, very, very small portion of us in the room. And as an unintended result, we end up with a bit of a distorted view of what sexual purity means. We come to believe that sexual purity is only something that can be maintained, that it's only something that we can hold on to, and we forget that sexual purity for the rest of us is not just something that has to be maintained, it's actually, more importantly, something that can be obtained. That we never find ourselves in a hopeless situation when it comes to sexual purity. And so we're going to dive into that a little bit today. I don't know about you guys, but I love playing in the mud. I think I probably love playing in the mud a little bit more than most of you, because as an adult, I found an excuse that would let me play in the mud a couple times a week. I go into a ceramic studio and I pretend to do art, but the truth is, I'm making stuff, but really I just want to get covered in mud. And I think most of you guys, if you reach back into your childhood, you can remember how much fun the mud is. I remember being 4 years old and loving getting covered in mud. I remember we had this big backyard. It probably wasn't that big. I was 4 years old. Everything seems enormous when you're 4 years old. But I remember we had this backyard that seemed enormous to me, and it was like around the edges of the backyard, there was all this grass and weeds and stuff, and there was this big tree that would hang over the back wall. I think it was a willow or something like that, and it would create kind of this cavernous room on the inside. And I remember I would get really excited but a little bit terrified every time I went through the willow branches and I went in there and there was this empty space in there, because it was really exciting because it was dark and cool and like something kind of like that, but a little bit more natural. And And I remember, I'd have to leave that space after a couple of minutes because it was too scary for me. And then in the middle of the yard, there was a big dirt patch, because Phoenix, right? You guys know the struggle. I'm sure most of you have a spot in the middle of your yard where there's nothing but dirt, because it's just dry clay and earth. And this is not a place where grass is supposed to grow. And my parents were kind enough that they would let me and my brother and the neighbor kids, we'd get to dig holes in that big giant dirt patch. And my brother and I, we had developed this giant bean-shaped hole in the backyard, and my favorite thing to do was to go out there with a shovel to dig it up a little bit, make it a little bit deeper, a little bit bigger, and then grab the hose and fill it up, and then put the dirt back in there and smush it up until we had this silky, smooth, creamy mud that we could play in. I think some of you are having a very nostalgic moment like me right now, remembering that mud. And we would get in the mud and we would sit down, and then we would start to scramble to see who could get the most mud, as if we were living in a world with an economy of mud, right? Whoever had the most mud was the wealthiest person in the kingdom of mud. Whoever could build the tallest tower, the biggest pyramid of sloppy, wet mud, they were the greatest architect the mud world had ever known. And I remember the dream was that someday we might dig this hole deep enough that I could sink in past my feet, my ankles, my knees, my waist, my chest, my shoulders, and into my head, where I would be completely submerged in the beautiful mud. I remember Clayface from Batman was my favorite bad guy, because he was living the dream, right? He was all mud, head to toe. And I remember thinking, I want to be Clayface, but I'll be like a good guy Clayface, but I want to be made out of mud. And no matter how much I loved playing in the mud, there always came a moment in time where I was ready to go back inside. Right? Maybe it's because I was hungry. Maybe it's because it was bedtime. Maybe it's because my favorite TV show was on. And for those of you who are old enough to remember the days before Netflix, when your show is on, you drop what you're doing and you go, because you don't know if the rerun's ever going to play. And that's a serious thing. Man, Netflix is a good thing, isn't it? It's a bad thing too, but it's a good thing. So I would come to this point where I was ready to go inside, and I would walk up to the back door where my mom would be waiting for me, and I would look at her covered in mud, and I would say, I'm ready to come back inside. And she would look at me, and there's something I didn't understand as a 4-year-old that I've come to understand as an adult, that there is this fundamental principle of the universe, written in the laws of physics, that 4-year-olds who are covered in mud and carpeted living rooms cannot, or at the very least should not, mix. So I didn't understand that I couldn't come inside like that, but my mom would look at me, and I'm fortunate that I had a good mom who never looked at me and said, ooh, Alec, you're filthy. You're going to be banished to the backyard. That creepy cavernous tree is going to be your new home, and the stray cats will be your new brother and sister. You can never come back inside because you're just so dirty. No, I had a good mom. And so she would say, okay. And she would walk around to the side of the house, grab the hose, turn it on, and say, come to me, and I'll get you clean. And she would begin to hose me off head to toe. She knew that that wasn't something I could do for myself, because those of you who have 4-year-olds know better than I do that a 4-year-old is not capable of getting themselves clean. 4-year-olds don't understand that they have like a bottom of their foot, or like a back, or like that mud can get between their ears, or maybe in their hair. They might like hose their hair down, and they're like, oh, I'm clean, but it's still just like there's just wet or more wet mud falling down their face. Right, 4-year-olds are incapable of cleaning themselves. They forget that there's mud in the pockets, too, because they put it there because, it's money. So the economy of mud, you want to have mud in that pocket. They don't know that. And so they need someone to wash them, to make them clean. And then when my mom was done washing me and every single drop of mud was gone, she would bring me inside and wrap me in a towel. And I would eat the food that she had prepared for me, sleep in the bed that she had made for me under the roof that her and my father had provided for me. And I would be a part of their family. And I would be home. I needed to be cleaned. Now, there are some children in the world, they are very few and very far between, who for whatever reason manage to live their entire life without getting so muddy that they would not be welcome in the home. I would not be surprised to find out that there were none of them in this room. Maybe there's one, maybe there's two. I imagine there are probably more unicorns in the forest than there are those children in the room or in our city. But they do exist. There are kids who, for whatever reason, were never compelled, were never tempted by the mud. Or maybe they were a little bit, but they were a little bit more mature than the rest of us at that age. And they looked at the mud and they said, you know what, that looks like fun, but I won't be able to go back inside once I get muddy. And I don't want to have to go through the process of getting clean. They are so few, though. So for the rest of us, what do we do when we're muddy? For the rest of us, for whom sexual purity is a ship that has already sailed, do we have any hope? Yeah, we do. Yeah, we do. Jesus is on the side of the house with the hose, and it's on, and he's saying, come to me, and I'll get you clean so you can come inside and you can be a part of my family. And Jesus is good at getting us clean. He knows what to do. Now, I think, unfortunately, in the church, with best intentions, we've misunderstood this. I think we've had a conversation where we kind of missed the mark, and it's had some really, really damaging consequences. I've sat in more than a few small groups or Bible studies or accountability groups, and I've heard someone talk about this concept of a purity card. Some of you who might have grown up in the 90s may have actually at some point in time had a little card that you signed that said, oh, I'm not going to do anything bad sexually speaking my whole life. And it's developed, and there's great intentions. I'm not trying to knock you if you did that. If it was effective for you, wonderful. If you ever taught that, I'm not trying to say you did something wicked or wrong, but I think this is where we've overemphasized the wrong thing. This is where we've overemphasized the staying out of the mud as the only way we can get pure, and we've forgotten the good news of the gospel when it comes to our sexuality, that Jesus can make us clean again. And so we have this idea of this purity card, that's something that you're given at birth, and you only get one, and you'll never get another, and once it's gone, and that's it, and you're done. There's no redemption. Jesus will forgive you, but you're still not pure anymore. For some reason, we apply this to our sexuality, but not as much to any other sin or any other facet of purity. And I think it's done something really damaging in the church. I have a friend, and the conversation I had with this particular friend is one I've had with many, many, many people, but I can remember specifically this conversation with this one friend of mine where they were explaining to me how when they were a child, they were sexually abused. And that left them with this question and this uncertainty about their purity. And they grew up and they were following Jesus, and they weren't making any mistakes or any failures of their own, sexually speaking, but they had this burning question, am I still pure? Am I still clean? Am I still really a virgin? And it didn't matter how many good leaders explained to them, no, that was never a decision you make. That wasn't a sin of yours. That was the sin of someone else's. You are still pure and still clean. It didn't matter how much someone articulated that to them because it didn't jive with the concept of purity card that they had learned. Because they can say 1 + 1 = 2, and they can add those things up, and it just didn't seem to make sense. And so they had this burning question, am I still pure? Am I still clean? And they grew up and they got out of high school and they went on into early adulthood, and then there was this particular evening where it wasn't a temptation towards sexual pleasure that drew them in. It wasn't a lie of intimacy drawing them in, but it was a temptation of getting a satisfying answer to this question that caused them to go out one night and find someone to sleep with. And I remember my friend explaining to me the feelings that were washing over them after they slept with this person, the first time they ever consensually slept with someone. And there was a little bit of guilt and a little bit of shame, my friend said, but overwhelmingly those feelings were eclipsed by a sigh of relief that came from their very soul that said, finally, I know that I'm dirty. I know that I'm not clean. I know that I'm not a virgin anymore. Finally, I have a satisfying answer to that question. What have we done? What have we done that in the church that we've missed something so vital about the gospel and such a pivotal part of our lives that has led to that result? And the truth is, I can guarantee you there are a handful, if not dozens of you in this room who have that exact same story. And my guess is there's probably even more who have a very similar story where it wasn't abuse, it wasn't something non-consensual, it was just a decision that you made at some point in time to jump in the mud because it sounded like fun. Maybe you knew it was wrong, maybe you didn't at the time, but it was a decision that you made. And then you decided, you know what? Oh, the purity card is gone. I can never get clean again. I'm stuck. So I might as well get back in the mud over and over and over again. I might as well make my home here. There's no hope to get clean. Every time I get out of the mud and I start scraping it off of myself, I realize I'm still stained. We have missed the gospel when it comes to our sexuality. No matter how stained you are, no matter how dirty you are, Jesus can get you clean. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's not as though, the purity card is gone forever, Jesus will forgive you, but you're still going to be rotten for the rest of your life. No, Jesus is really good at cleaning. He doesn't stop halfway. He is a good, good mother. He's a good father. He knows how to wash us. A few years ago, I kind of started to realize this and piece this together because I was watching the sixth graders. I've been a high school pastor. I've been a pastor here for a long time. I did youth ministry for 2 or 3 years as a volunteer leader. I interned for 1 year, and then I was the junior high pastor for 3 years, and now I'm just rounding out my 5th year as the high school pastor. And as such, I've gotten to actually, just a couple weeks ago, I graduated my 2nd class of 6th graders out of high school and into early adulthood. And I've been paying attention to the things that we say around church, and I realize that this is an era where we've started to make some mistakes. I've had more than a few conversations with someone who at one point in time was a small, innocent 11-year-old child, relatively innocent and even ignorant when it came to sexuality. And I've sat across from them a few years later as they were telling me about their brokenness in their sexuality, about the failings that they had made. And I've seen the weight of the hopelessness of I can never be clean, that card is gone. And when I started to realize this, I asked myself, is what we're talking about really what's in the scripture? And so I started looking about what does the Bible say about sexuality and about purity, and I realized something really interesting that kind of surprised me. The Bible has a lot to say about sexuality. It has a lot to say about immorality and morality when it comes to sexuality. It has a lot to say about purity, but most of the time it doesn't actually overlap those two things. Usually when it talks about purity, it's not talking exclusively about sexual purity. It's talking about head to toe, your body, your soul, your heart, your spirit, your mind, this full and complete purity, and it's not singling out a conversation on purity. And I think that's interesting because you guys knew when you looked at the sermon title for today, when it said purity for the rest of us, you knew that we were continuing to talk about sex. Because in church, when we say purity, we mean sex 99% of the time. But that's not what we see in the Bible. Now, there are a few places in the scripture where those two concepts do overlap, and the Bible has a lot to say about sexuality and about purity, don't get me wrong. I'm sure there are more that I have not been able to find, but I have thus far been able to find about 3 of them. Three places in the scripture where those two concepts are exclusively intertwined. The first is a place where it talks about how important it is that the marriage bed remain undefiled. The second is in Corinthians, and Melissa did a fantastic job preaching on that last week. If you didn't catch that, I'd really encourage you to go on our app or on YouTube and to watch that or give it a listen. And there's a lot of parallels between that. And the third place is here in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 3 through 7. And it says this, it is God's will that you should be sanctified, that you should avoid sexual immorality, that each of you should learn to control your own body in a way that is holy and honorable, not in passionate lust like the pagans who do not know God, and that in this matter no one should wrong or take advantage of a brother or sister. The Lord will punish all those who commit such sins, as we told you and warned you before. For God did not call us to be impure, but to live a holy life. So what does Paul start off saying? He says, it is God's will for you that you would be sanctified. Now pay attention to the verbiage here because he's using some active verbiage here, not passive verbiage. He's not saying it's God's will for you that you would remain sanctified, that you would stay sanctified. He's saying it's God's will for you that you would be sanctified, that you would become sanctified. That word sanctified, in case you didn't know, means to be made clean completely and totally and holy, to be set apart, to be made pure. It is God's will for you that you would become sanctified. And if that sentence wasn't clear enough, if that verbiage wasn't clear enough, pay attention to the next few verses because he says, look guys, here, church in Thessalonica, there's an issue that we need to address. Some of you have been sexually exploiting others in the church. Whew. That's not light stuff. These are not innocent people when it comes to their sexuality in the church that he's talking to. These are people who are dirty, who are broken, and he's saying God's will for you is that you would be sanctified. Sexual purity is not only something that can be maintained, it is also something that can be obtained. It's not only something that we have to hold on to from birth, it's also something that we can receive from the Lord as he washes us. Paul here, when he's writing to the church in Thessalonica, he's not talking to the 8-year-old girl who's never had a crush on a boy and telling her, stay away from those boys who smoke them cigarettes. He's talking to the 28-year-old woman who's had more sexual partners than birthdays. And he's saying, come to Jesus, he'll get you clean. He's not talking to the 4-year-old boy who still thinks that girls are ucky. He's talking to the 40-year-old man whose pornography addiction and infidelity has cost him 2 marriages. And Paul is saying to him, come to Jesus, he'll get you clean. He's saying your sexual purity is not something that can only be maintained, it is also something that can be obtained. This is the gospel. Why have we cut it out from our conversations on sexuality and left ourselves with only a conversations about sexual morality and forgotten what sexual purity really means and how we get to it? Why have we forgotten that ship has not sailed for us because of the blood of Jesus? There is no sexual brokenness that is too strong for the sacrifice that Jesus made. It does not matter. I know that we've been getting scared, some of us, because there's so much more sexual brokenness churning up in our world, and maybe you're seeing people that you love falling deeper and deeper into sexual brokenness that looks a little bit new and a little bit foreign to you. Well, guess what? Don't be afraid. Whether it's you experiencing that or ones that you love, because there is no sexual brokenness more permanent than the blood of Jesus. He can wash us. End of story. And Paul, he doesn't leave them there just with this idea, with this concept that maybe Jesus can cleanse you and make you clean. He actually gives some steps to take. He doesn't leave us with an ethereal thought of maybe Jesus will wave a magic wand and ta-da, you're sexually pure again. He says, no, there are some steps for us to take. And what he says is flee sexual immorality. Walk away from it. Essentially what he's saying is get out of the mud and come to Jesus so he can get you clean. But you got to get out of the mud. It doesn't matter if you bring fists full of earth with you. It doesn't matter if you're dripping head to toe, covered completely. It doesn't matter if every single square inch of your clothing is stained. Come to Jesus. He'll wash you. He'll make you clean. He'll make you pure. No ifs, ands, or buts. I had always believed that there were some ifs and some ands and some buts about that. I had heard that in church, in a good church. And I'd missed it. As though the blood of Jesus wasn't sufficient for my sexual failings. But it is. And the experience I've had in my life is that Jesus is capable of washing it all away. But we got to get out of the mud. And it doesn't matter if we fall into the mud on the way to Jesus a dozen times. It doesn't matter if we get halfway washed and then we say, wait, I'm going to jump back in the mud again. It doesn't matter if we have an addiction that calls us into the mud over and over and over and over again. Jesus can wash us. There is hope. There is purity for every single one of us in this room, regardless of what your sin is. It does not matter. Yeah, he's that good. He's that good. It means something for me. My guess is it means something for you. It's a profound reality that changes the game. I am a bit of a nerd. I know I look like a homeless person and not a nerd, but under all of this, there is a nerd, I promise. My wife will tell you the truth of it. And as a nerd, I really love watching TED Talks. And the nerdier the TED Talk, the more likely I am to watch it start to finish. In particular, I have found one of the veins of TED Talks that seems to be popping up a lot lately that gets me excited is talks on neuroscience. Now, I know the vast majority of you in the room hear the word neuroscience and think, boring, next. Not watching that video. I think, yes. I'm going to go deep down this rabbit hole of YouTube neuroscience talks. And I've noticed in all these conversations about neuroscience, there's this particular buzzword that I hear over and over and over again, and it's the word neuroplasticity. If you're super bored because you just heard a word like neuroplasticity, that's right, you can check out, come back in a minute or two, I promise we'll loop this around for you. And neuroplasticity essentially means that our brains are plastic, not like water bottle plastic, but like they're moldable and changeable and they're different. And in particular, one of the areas where this has a lot of significant consequences is when the neuroscientists say neurons that fire together wire together. I'm not smart enough to understand what that means, but essentially my understanding of it is this. In our brain, in our mind, in our heart, when we engage in a particular activity that has a particular response, whether it's a reward or a consequence, our brain creates a link between that activity and that response that might not have existed before. And then when we do that activity again and get the same response again, there's a stronger connection in our mind. And then we do it again, it's stronger and stronger and stronger every single time we engage in this particular activity and get this particular response. And when we stop engaging in that activity or getting that response, that connection in our mind, it begins to erode, to wither away until there's not much of a connection, if any at all, that remains. This is significant to our sexuality. It's kind of like if you've ever been off-roading, right? Especially when it's been a little bit rainy and wet and where the roads are a bit muddy, and you go in your truck and you drive down a particular path because you don't really have an option because there's these tire trenches, because so many vehicles have driven back and forth and back and forth and back and forth over this very specific route in the road. And the trenches, every time someone drives over that, the trenches get deeper and deeper and deeper to the point where the only option that you have is to drive the exact same turns that everyone else has made before on this road. And then eventually someone says, you know what, I don't like that route because it's too muddy or because there's a big dirt or there's a big rock or something like that, so I got to change course a little bit. And so someone goes off to the side a little bit for the first time, and they clear a path through the brush with their tire tracks, and then the next person follows them, and over and over and over again until now you have new tracks going in a different direction. And as that's happening, these old tracks are beginning to erode and wash away. And this is what happens in our mind. Now, how does this apply to our sexuality? We could apply this to almost any situation in our sexuality, but let's talk about maybe a pornography addiction. When you sit down and you look at a screen with pornographic images, you're doing an activity that is connecting in your mind with a particular response, with the emotions and the chemicals and the feelings that were intended for intimacy and sexual pleasure. And your mind connects those two things, and you start to build this connection to this screen, and then something unique happens with pornography that doesn't happen in a real relationship, where there is this novelty in pornography. There's something different. Sometimes, once or twice a minute or at multiple times a second, you're flipping through different images, seeing different people, different acts. And your brain and your mind and your heart start to associate sexuality with novelty, with something different. This is one of the many reasons why pornography is so destructive. Because we hit this point where in order to be sexually aroused, in order to feel a sense of intimacy, I need novelty. I need different. And most people, they won't tell you in person, but they'll say it on an anonymous survey, who have a pornography addiction will admit that they are now looking at things that they found morally reprehensible when they first started their addiction. Why? Because they need more, they need different, they need new, they need something they've never seen before. And one of the problems with that is that no spouse will ever be able to provide the amount of sexual novelty that the internet can. No one person can ever provide that. And so the results are that in many marriages where someone is struggling from a pornography addiction, there's a lack of intimacy. Why? Because the tracks are so deep and they're so entrenched in this direction that they can no longer go in this direction. They can't get out of that rut. Some people find themselves physically incapable of responding to their spouse because their spouse is not a cell phone screen. But there's good news, because this is a mechanism actually that God put inside of us, that God wired in our brain. The original intention of this mechanism was not for sexual immorality, but was for sexual fidelity, was for a spouse. And so in a marriage where there's not infidelity, and in a marriage where there's not a pornography addiction, what happens is those tire tracks that are so much bad news over here, they're really good news over here. Because every time you go to your spouse for intimacy and sexual connection, those tracks, they get deeper and they get deeper and they get deeper to the point where it actually becomes very easy to connect with your spouse. To the point where you could almost let go of the steering wheel for a little bit and you would find yourself in an intimate place with your spouse. Now, is it possible to take a sharp turn to the right or to the left and to jump out of those tracks and to find yourself someplace you ought not to be? Yeah, absolutely. Is that temptation always going to be there? Yeah, absolutely. When Jesus defeated the power of sin, it wasn't temptation he defeated. The power of sin is death, not temptation. But when we choose to say, I'm going to abandon the immorality and I'm going to focus in on my spouse, whether I have a spouse or not, whether I ever even intend to have a spouse, I'm going to focus in on sexual purity, on fleeing immorality and letting Jesus wash me. What happens is these tracks over here towards the immorality, they begin to erode and wash away to the point where there's just really not much of a road over there at all. This is the power of Jesus. This is the hope that we have in him. Sexual purity is not only something that can be maintained. It is also something that can be obtained. Sexual purity comes when we get out of the mud and we come to Jesus and we let him get us clean. And I imagine that there are a few of you in the room, and by a few I would say probably the majority, that have felt or currently feel filthy. You see your sexual brokenness and you say, oh, I wish that I could be one of those few people who was never compelled to get in the mud. I wish that I had had the self-control. But I've proven to myself and to Jesus over and over and over again that I love the mud too much to ever be pure. You're not without hope. Maybe you say, I tried to get myself clean. I tried to scrape off the mud, but I'm a 4-year-old and I don't know what I'm doing and I'm still filthy. You're not without hope. The gospel applies not just in eternity, but also today. Maybe your marriage feels like it's crumbling because you keep going back to the mud. You're not without hope. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Come to Jesus. Come to the side of the house where his blood is flowing through that hose, and he will wash away every single stain, and you will be pure like you never knew you were before. You will be innocent like a child. He will wash away those tracks of immorality in your mind and in your heart and in your spirit, and you will begin to form new ones that are pure and holy and right and clean. That's the way sexual purity works for the rest of us. I'm going to ask you to just close your eyes for just a minute and to just kind of have a conversation with Jesus. Because I know that hearing this is very different from receiving it. And I know that receiving it is very different from living it. If you feel like you have been stained, if you feel like you have been dirty your whole life, I want you to just talk to Jesus and say, Jesus, would you wash me? Would you help me to see how clean you've made me? Jesus, would you help me get out of the mud? Jesus, I want to come into the house. I want to be a part of your family again. And as we sing this next song, I know it might be embarrassing, but the truth is it's, like we said, it's most of us in the room who feel dirty. And as we sing this next song, if you feel like you've been in the mud, or maybe you've been running around the backyard still covered in mud, not sure what to do, trying to get yourself clean, but it's been failing. If you feel like you need to take a step, maybe it's a step you'll have to take over and over and over again, but if you feel like you need to do something to say, Jesus, would you come and get me clean? I'd ask you to just abandon your shame. Jesus isn't interested in your shame. He's interested in your glory and your purity. Just abandon your shame, leave it in your seat, and then come up and bow down before the Lord as we worship him. And in your heart say, Jesus, this is me getting out of the mud. Can this be you washing me, getting me clean? And if you want, there's going to be people up here to pray for you. And if you want to just kind of have a time alone between you and Jesus, that's all right. You can get on the ground too and just worship him and ask him to clean you. He's doing it, and he's good at it, and he will not leave a drop of mud on you. But Jesus, we come to you and we worship you, and we ask that you would cleanse us. We ask that you would make us holy and pure. Jesus, I pray for sexual purity over this entire church, that you would cleanse the marriages, Lord. Those marriage beds would become undefiled, Lord, that you would cleanse our hearts, that you would wash us with your blood of the mud that has stained us. That those of us who no longer have the option of maintaining sexual purity, that we can obtain it through you. and then maintain it from there. Our hope is in you, Jesus. Make us pure again.